Welcome to Voices for Freedom, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to highlighting the tragic and powerful stories of victims of communist countries, past and present, and to helping raise voices for freedom around the world. I'm Ashley Davis, Director of Public Affairs, and I am pleased to present to you today Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo, a Cuban writer and photographer currently based in St. Louis, Missouri. Before we hear from Orlando, I would like to present Ken McGrath, Director of the Victims of Communism St. Louis Commission, who will share about our commission activities in St. Louis and will moderate the Q&A following Orlando's presentation. In support of our mission, VOC established local commissions last year. These commissions are designed in collaboration with local residents and community leaders who are committed to telling the truth about communism and to preserving the memory of its victims. We launched our first commission in St. Louis, Missouri, due to the uptick in communist activity in the area and the infiltration into the local government there. Ken McGrath spearheads our volunteers in St. Louis who are working to educate locals about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism. Orlando and Kim, thank you for joining us today. Kim, I'll give you the floor to share more about what Victims of Communism St. Louis Commission is doing and how local witnesses like Orlando are involved in the commission.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello to everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today for this event. As Ashley mentioned, I'm Kim McGrath. I am the director of the Victims of Communism St. Louis Commission, and as a lifelong St. Louisan, I am so very thrilled and so honored to be a part of this initiative and to be involved with establishing VOC's first local commission here in the city of St. Louis. Also very happy to be with you all today as we hear from our wonderful speaker. So why the city of St. Louis? The city of St. Louis has a long history of welcoming immigrants, in particular those who are coming from Southeast Asia as political refugees. The mission of Victims of Communism is a perfect match for this community and for the events and activities that have been happening in our city for many years, particularly in and around the South St. Louis area. For years, there have been communist leaders and organizers working to build their presence and working to build support of Marxist ideology. Essentially, we're seeing two main efforts that are happening. On one hand, there are local groups who vandalize and destroy, who use communist symbols alongside graffiti and messages that are calling for violence, that are calling for people to rise up and take action, essentially that are calling for revolution. This graffiti includes flyers, spray painting, and other types of vandalism that we've been seeing. Most recently, the Soldiers Memorial Museum in downtown St. Louis had a large red hammer and sickle painted alongside the museum, which the museum itself honors military service veterans and their families. On the other hand, there's a more concentrated political effort by Communist Party leaders and members. In the 8th Ward, a Communist Party USA member has served as chairman of the ward's local Democratic organization. Also recently, a National Communist Party USA board member ran as a Democrat to become alderman of the 14th Ward here in St. Louis. Victims of Communism has been working to expose these efforts and to be transparent and tell the truth about these activities taking place in the city. We formed in August, though we've been active here since last spring when we hosted an event series at the Moolah Lounge, including a film screening and discussion of the highest grossing film in Lithuanian history called Ashes in the Snow. This tells the story of a young woman and her family who were deported to Siberia amidst Stalin's brutal dismantling of the Baltic region. This film screening and educator workshop drew nearly 200 individuals from across the St. Louis region, and we've continued to be active ever since. This past fall, VOC St. Louis ran a successful billboard series, which ran from September through to December. Our commission here and the foundation's national headquarters have been sharing information on this, getting posts on social media, which have drawn local media coverage and have drawn reactions from around the world. We've been featured numerous times for different initiatives here in St. Louis and also covered nationally, including the Voice of America Vietnam, who featured a story on one of our billboards featuring Mother Mushroom, who is a Vietnamese activist and blogger. Our leadership and our volunteers are working here with local residents to help tell the truth about communism. We are actively engaging volunteers and asking for support for many people across the city to support us in a number of key areas, including educational outreach, event planning, and community engagement. Recently, we shared information on important legislation here in the state of Missouri, the House Concurrent Resolution 59, which would designate November 7th as Victims of Communism Memorial Day. This effort has happened in other states, and we support this type of legislation here in the state of Missouri. As I mentioned, St. Louis has a long history of welcoming immigrants, in particular those coming from Southeast Asia, as political refugees, many of whom were fleeing the threat of communist oppression, which was experienced in Laos and Thailand in the 1970s. These and other voices are critical in telling the truth about communism. And that is why we are so thrilled today to have a local St. Louis resident who has lived experience, who has been directly affected by communism, who will share his story and encourage others to speak out and to get involved. Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo is a writer and photographer, among other things. He graduated in biochemistry from Havana University. He blogs at Lunes de post-Revolución, translated into English as Post-Revolution Monday. He edited the Cuban independent digital magazine Cacharro, the Revolution Evening Post, and Voces. In 2013, he had to leave Cuba, and since then has been giving lectures in U.S. universities about social activism, civil society, and new tendencies in Cuban literature and its censorship by the state. He has participated in several academic events, including the ASCE Congress 2014 and LASA Congress 2015. In Cuba, he published the books of narrative Collage Karaoke in 2001, Empezar de cero, also 2001, Ipatrías 2005, and Mi nombre es William Saroyan in 2006. His fiction book, Boring Home, was censored by LETRAS CUBANAS publishing house in 2009, and later it was published abroad. Orlando was arrested 3 times on the island by Castro's political police. In 2014, he published his Cuban new narrative anthology, Cuba and Splinters, and also published his digital photo book, Abandoned Havana, with a preface by Jon Lee Anderson. Since 2016, he studies in a Ph.D. program in Comparative Literature at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, on the topic of political pilgrims to the Cuban Revolution. We thank Orlando for his time and for joining us today. Are so very excited to have him here, to have him share his expertise, and to share his personal perspective. So thanks to all of you for joining, and I will turn it over to Orlando for him to give his discussion and have time for some Q&A.
Thank you very much. Just unmuted the microphone. My pleasure, my great honor to share with you Victims of Communism Commission in St. Louis. Kim McGrath, Director, thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, thank you to Ashley Davis, Director of Public Affairs of Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I have been aware of all the work that this organization leads in Washington, D.C. and in other cities and North America, because now with internet, it's very important labor that takes place in the world, raising awareness about one of the most devastating social phenomenon, political phenomenon of the 20th century that certainly seems to be expanding over again in the 21st century in a way that that's the first. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo. We have 2 family names in Hispanic countries, and I am a Cuban blogger, writer, maybe photographer, that during the last 10 years, I have been, maybe a little more, have been working as part of the Cuban civil society, if that exists, because under the current conditions of the political tyranny that we live in Cuba, where the Communist Party of Cuba is the only one which is allowed to exist according to the Cuban Constitution. We Cubans cannot be socialists. We Cubans cannot be social democrats. We Cubans cannot be ecologists and organize ourselves. We cannot organize ourselves in minority organizations or political parties that have certain strategy that is not the strategy of the Communist Party of Cuba. So in these conditions, allow me to start by saying this is political tyranny. Some of you who are watching me, maybe you are from a radical leftist ideology, may love it. But the term political tyranny is not an invention. It's something that I grew up as full of pride in the school. In elementary school, I was taught that we were living in the dictatorship of the proletarians or the proletariat. And that I was a proletarian, by the way. My family was very poor and everybody in Cuba was very poor. The oppressors had been displaced, had been jailed, exiled, and executed. And in those conditions, a kind of new harmony or utopian society had been reached. That is my experience as a young boy growing in Cuba. And eventually when I end up in the university and start getting like a political awareness, I realized somehow that one of the most traumatizing experiences on the island is not so much the repression, which happens and could be traumatizing, but also the feeling of a civil desert. You don't have allies in Cuban society. A brutality, something arbitrary arrest, abuse of power happens, then the press will not publish your complaint. The TV, which is called public TV, will never allow a common citizen to speak there. All the institutions of the public sphere, which I really doubt it deserves that name in a totalitarian society, belong or are private property of the Communist Party. They have been privatized. So public institutions in Cuba, and Cuba had both public and private televisions in the 50s, they were completely not nationalized, but became property of the state, not of the nation. And that difference, especially given the charisma and the revolutionary rhetoric of Fidel Castro during decades, a lot of confusion has happened between the terms nation, country, nation, state, government, and that kind of utopian term, empty signifier called revolution. Who dares to stand against the revolution? I consider myself a revolutionary. Everybody wants to revolutionize their own time, to live maybe with the look in the future, trying, of course, to fight against injustices that takes place everywhere, in every time. And suddenly that rhetoric has been so attractive, so fascinating. I always remember the essay by the American philosopher Susan Sontag, Fascinating Fascism. And in many ways, maybe we can make some reflections about the connections between two totalitarian lines in the 20th centuries, both of them deeply anti-capitalist and certainly anti-democracy. Democracy was not working or didn't seem to be working in certain historical periods of humanity, and there was a solution against that, the totalitarian thought of communism, and of course, the totalitarian thought of fascism. In some moments, bitter enemies. In some moments, the biggest military allies in the history of humanity. And I'm talking of Second World War, no need to go in details about that. So the idea of coming from a communist society and then landing in America is completely a myth in Cuba. Many generations of young people in Cuba grew up listening to American music, trying to symphonize some kind of stations, FM station, trying to listen to concerts, maybe some baseball, sports, and of course, why not? Politics, because this is the second paradox. Living in a hyper-politicized society like communist Cuba, I hadn't, and no Cuban had ever had a political experience. We don't have political spectrum. I have been accused in the recent years of being a rightist, of being a Cuban from Miami, like if that were a stigma. Imagine somebody labeling Mexicans because they are Mexican from Tijuana. Imagine how racist and discriminatory that speech would be in America, but it's perfectly fine to say those Cubans from Miami, they know nothing, they have no gratitude against socialism, they don't understand anything, they only care about a car and buying in the mall. That stereotype is also something that I have been fighting, and fighting especially in a number of academias, universities, well, right now my Ph.D. is taking place at Washington University in San Luis, but in many other universities, there is this idea, but do you live in Havana? The obsession of asking the immigrant, because by the way, I'm an immigrant. The obsession of asking an immigrant, are you from there? Something that you wouldn't ask other immigrants. To Cubans, because of political and ideological agendas, is perfectly well legitimate to delegitimize sectors and millions of Cubans because they do not do well, because they are not servant citizens or captive citizens on the island. A number of paradoxes that are enough to make people embitter themselves. That's not my case, fortunately. I'm still able to smile. I'm still able to say openly Cuba, at the same time being a totalitarian tyranny, is not an Orwellian hell. I was a happy child and teenager in Cuba in a way that maybe I will never be in America, with all my freedoms, fundamental freedoms, and human rights guaranteed. Maybe I was much more happier under totalitarian conditions. That entails, it's another conversation about the community of affections, the solidarity that we felt there, the spirit of resistance and opposition against a very abusive reality that in the experience of freedom, openness, or why not schizo-capitalism, a capitalism where everything is possible and possible at the same time. So we hear many narratives at the same time. The experience of diversity, technically, no? In Cuba, the experience of non-diversity, a country that being revolutionary does not accept a single immigrant. There are no programs for immigrants to go to Cuba. Go to America, denounce America, blame America first. That famous speech that I got to know here when I managed to be in America. And always the tendency by many sectors, and including, of course, radical leftists or communists, including the organized communists of the Communist Party of the United States of America, blame America first. It's like a self-hatred, but with an extra and another characteristic, which is they have discovered and treasured a historical scientific truth. Who dares to go against science? It would be reactionary, obscurantist, retrograde, who dares to go against science. So once that a party constitutes itself with a historical truth, anything in the world must be done to implement, to put into practice that truth. Those citizens, those masses of citizens who do not understand or share that truth, arrogantly, the communists say with a lot of arrogance, they need to be educated because their eyes are blinded by capitalism, exploitation, capital, money, whatever, no? Markets. So the communists in a democratic society certainly have an agenda that, using the democratic mechanism, claiming peaceful activism, advocacy, freedom of speech, that discovery of the communists, since that the communists discovered freedom of speech, no? And they claim so, the right of freedom of speech, in order to eliminate all the rights of freedom of speech against themselves. The same applies to abolishing property. We start with the super monopolies, with the super corporation. Eventually in Cuba, 7 years after the revolution, there was not a single newspaper printed. There was not a single university student printed newspaper. It was impossible to sell bread with fried eggs and maybe a beefsteak. Where scarcity eliminated the beefsteak early on. No? So the idea that a society to work needs to be perfectly controlled, clarified, and centralized by the state is what I say, because sometimes they tell me it works in theory, but in practice it fails. And I say, the theory doesn't work. Maybe in practice it does work. It works. Communism in Soviet Union worked for 70, 71 years. Yes, millions of people dying. Yes, but that's efficiency. Allow me to be sarcastical, sadly sarcastical. The 2.5 million of Cubans in exile, the dozens of hundreds of political prisoners, the economical disaster, it proves that communism works. In Venezuela, communism has worked perfectly, by the book, creating a scarcity, turning a disempowering citizen, all the contrary of the narrative or the narrative that they try to, for example, sell you when you read the party program of the Communist Party of the United States. I always detect the arrogance of somebody that holds a fundamental, universal truth, and also it's an absence, and with this I will be summarizing and closing my talk, the absence of what's the destiny, what's the fate of those who do not accept paradise or utopia, or allow me to say, those who do not believe in your social justice, because they don't consider it that is justice, that is just, and they certainly do not consider that is social, but is socialized. And socialized in many ways means privatized by the new powerful. And the new powerful cannot even organize in two parties. The American establishment has two main parties. Yes, I acknowledge that. The Communist Party perfects the system. It says, no two parties. All views, all races, all genders, all trans, and all those inventions and rights claim in a free, open society, because it's possible to do and fight for that, proudly fight for that, not in totalitarian society. All those ideas can be easily reconciled and solved within the Communist Party. That's why many of the, for example, Afro-American leaders of the Black Panthers and others, like the dozens, were hijacking planes and going to Cuba in the late 60s and 70s. Many of them ended up in jail in Cuba. As part of my PhD, I have been studying how many of them, when they try to reivindicate a speech of race, a speech of racial inequalities in Cuba, communist Cuba, they ended up being accused of racist, of being accused of fundamentalists. Of course, they never touch a gun again in Cuba, because it's illegal to have guns in Cuba. And eventually, many of them returned to America, even if they were to serve a sentence in a jail, because it was intolerable for the leftist, radical leftist activists to actually inhabit the radical leftist paradise. But let me insist in this. Maybe the Cuban paradise is not leftist, it's not rightist, because one political option should rely on the other to adjust, to get the proper balance. Where's the center? Where is the center right and the center left? This is why I know that Orlando Luis Pardo Lazo is a leftist intellectual. In Cuba, I didn't know. Here, I have been labeled as rightist, but I don't know. I'm still trying to get to understand which are the political species, because in a totalitarian system without political spectrum, allow me to at least express the feeling that I had never witnessed, the experience of a political debate in the Cuban media, the experience of seriously contradicting and exposing every single elected position in a country, from congressmen to local governors to the president of the United States of America, fire against him in the press, in the TV, questioning every single fact-checking every single information from the White House or in a tweet line. In Cuba, all those issues have been magically solved. And that's part of the fascination of fascism that Susan Sontag mentioned. Many leaders, party members of the Communist Party of the United States of America end up landing in Cuba, fascinated by a society that has law and order, a clear vision of the future, where dissent is certainly considered, is penalized, is considered a crime. Dissent can only be understood as a desire to destroy the Cuban society. However, and this is the end of my talk, I promise, the Communist Party of the United States of America is able to publish in the website that they are working under certain conditions in capitalism in order to erode and destroy capitalism and democracy, because it's a society committed to self-destruction. And this is the words of the leaders and on other famous intellectuals, is the permanent war against market economy and representational democracy. The alternative, no rush. I will explain you the alternative, maybe in the questioning and answering, and the Communist Party will explain you the alternative to capitalism when the time comes, when you already cannot reverse back. The transition from capitalism to socialism is possible. Why not? There should be no repression if the people choose so, but the people will know later that there is no possibility of reversing, that there is no possibility within a communist society to transform, to modify the law, to eventually open to market economy again. So, of course, I know that communism failed in Russia, and I know that communism failed in many countries, but that transition is, well, that's another topic to discuss. How suddenly it surprised everybody that communism failed, and why communists in America and Latin America still insist that a failed system has an alternative in future. I would like to stop here, and I'm very happy to listen to whatever comments from the audience, and if whatever questions or questionings you have for me.
Thank you very, very much, Orlando, for your talk and for your perspective. We have a couple of questions coming in here. Particularly, you were talking about communists who are operating in a democratic society, saying that they have a radical agenda and claim to be supporting freedom of speech, but in fact don't. You asked about the idea of social justice, and that socialized means privatized by the new leaders. I wonder if you could talk a little bit to how you see that playing out today in the US.
Yes, it's a complex territory. Although I have been naturalized as an American citizen, I still respectfully feel as an outsider of the long-term American tradition, political tradition. But maybe the comment of a witness as an outsider respectfully would be, I feel, and I have felt it in my body, the accusations that I have received, even at Washington University in St. Louis, I feel that the term has been co-opted. From the closing of the American mind to the cobbling of the American mind, the term social justice, political correctness, cultural appropriation, all those terms have been co-opted in a way that the conversation cannot start. If it happens to me to say, I seriously prefer not to use the PC word, the political correctness word, because it reminds me of the PC party in Cuba, the party of communists in Cuba, PC and PC. If it happens to make a joke, that I decide to make a joke about that, I'm already labeled as many ugly words that I will not repeat, because this is not the conversation that I want to have. This is not the conversation that I'm a person that favors social justice. However, I may oppose the agenda of those who say that social justice is like a mantra that is defined by the way that those following certain agendas decide. No, the language is chosen by me. I do not impose my language on anybody. My books, please do not buy them. Have Abandoned Havana by Restless Book, Cuban Splinters by All Books. You don't need to buy them. I am not imposing them on national TV like I have been imposed a revolutionary rhetoric during decades in communist Cuba. So my message would be, please take some time to think how open the American society is right now, and how unnecessary is to radicalize, to create a completely climate where conversations cannot start, because it seems to be that certain perspectives are banned. And this has been published even in the newspaper Student Life at Washington University in St. Louis. Some editorials, some op-eds saying, yes, there are some narratives, especially conservative narratives, that deserve to be punched down, is the term that I learning still English. It's okay to punch up against those narratives, but punch down, what they call punch down, for example, this conference maybe is punching down on somebody that we don't know, is not okay. So with that narrative, it's very poor in intellectual terms, and I would like those people in good faith that really love and care about social justice and social equality, consider how many spaces American society and American democracy has. And this is not something that we owe to the president or to the government. This is something that the people of the United States of America has given to themselves. And I feel very proud of being able to join and somehow push in the direction of their fundamental freedom and the rights of such a noble nation as the United States of America, with all the terrible social evils that this society has had and still have, of course.
Thank you. We're getting some more questions in here too. Lots of great questions coming through. One person is asking about kind of American perception of communism. So a lot of Americans, when they hear someone use the word communism or mention the word communism, they associate it with the McCarthyism and repression that we saw in the US, instead of associating it with being totalitarian. Can you talk to this in terms of how it's a fallacy for people to kind of explain away the poverty with these types of stereotypes?
Well, I don't know if I completely follow the question, but it's very clear in the political agenda, in the symbology, iconography, in what the communists publish in their programs. It's very clear that it's one stage after the other. First, they need to occupy a number of positions in Congress, a number of positions, legislative, judicial, executive. It's very clear according to them. I cannot speak for them. I read them and respect and transmit what they tell me, communists tell me. No? And so it's clear that it's stage by stage in order to transform the social awareness, one more time, this kind of I don't know, eugenics idea that the society will learn something that they already know. They are prophets. They have been illuminated by a scientific theory, very typical of the, this kind of thinking that all through the 19th century, everybody was discovering in a very, like a sect or cult thinking, no? That we correctly interpret the laws of history. Is it like the new God, no? And it will be expressed on earth by the state. Only that this cannot be implemented immediately. So in the absence of the revolution, we can erode the basis, the moral concepts of society, the political conventions, the traditions, the cultural traditions. Everything must be stained. Everything except the communist tradition is stained. Everything was dark. Everything was only profits, profits, profits. Homeland is a big bank. America is a big bank. There are no patriotic values according to the communists. There is a materialistic, economical interpretation of every single factor. And that interpretation, which I find interesting, cannot be contradicted. You will be like a cartoonish, or you will be, when they get power, you will be in jail. So I do think that it's not about, they say very clearly that they are not interested in socialism and democratic socialism, that they are not interested in evolution or reforms. That will only weaken the struggle against class structure in a society. So I don't see socialists or communists in Western society, America and Europe. I really don't see them, and I know very well the Spanish communism. I don't see that they really care about representative democracy. It's the lesser evil to survive and spread their ideas, which, by the way, they have the right to spread. But at the same time, it's very important to say, you are not the owner of equality. You are not the owner of social justice. And your precedence in history has been a disaster. But maybe the history of humanity itself has been war after war and being a disaster. So I don't like to make that argument so much. What I want to express is how come your utopian thinking will always work in the future, and then you will be demanding from me more and more sacrifices, giving away my corporations. Okay, you can take it. Cuban bourgeoisie gave the corporations to Fidel Castro in order to survive. Then they had to lose the second house that they had in the vacation resort. Then they had to lose their own house. And many of them, then they had to lose their life and their homeland forever. So the idea is technically, some videos we can find online, that the collective is all, the party is all, as the Chinese Communist Party slogan goes, and I also heard that in Cuba. The party is a military institution that controls and is always right. And this is Orwell, of course, George Orwell. If I say blue today and red tomorrow, or red today and blue tomorrow, I am right in both occasions without contradiction. That's the nature of totalitarianism. It's not that I was right and I changed my mind. It's that there is no contradiction between two things that the Communist Party expresses in different historical moments. So I find that a lot of demagoguery, and it's surprising how they shoot back and how they question Democratic and Republican politicians in America, and they start bringing all those completely idiotic vocabulary about fascism in America taking over, when the program of the party aligns and matches line by line the hyper-nationalization and hyper-socialist programs. Technically, property is a crime, it's a theft. Property is a theft. That's the idea behind socialism.
Thank you. And again, getting some more great questions in here. We'll try to hit as many as possible. Pardon me. Comment that your talk is very fascinating. And questions about you personally are coming in, Orlando. How were you able to leave Cuba? And what are things like for your family and friends there? Are you able to be in touch with them? Also, for our guests today, how can an average American help the people of Cuba and people like your family in their fight for human rights and democracy?
Yes, but briefly, I left Cuba with a visa as a visitor, when the Cuban government allowed for the first time in decades for Cubans, one, to have a passport. A passport is a document issued by the state. If it is issued by the state, it belongs to the state. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Citizens shouldn't have passports. That was my reality in life. Only when you were going to travel as part of your state enterprise. Eventually, the Cuban government allowed, because they were selling for $120 US dollars a passport to citizens, and then eventually they were selling exit permits, and of course also the visa, but this is also part of the embassy. Eventually in 2013, they launched a so-called migratory reform that allowed for a number of activists of Cuba to travel abroad. I have never returned to my country. I have never applied for political refuge. I have been, since then, giving lectures in a number of universities, and now trying to go for the program of a Ph.D. in comparative literature. My family remains in Cuba. They are not involved in politics, and at some point, in many ways, I was the black sheep of my family. I was the one who out of love, they were trying to shut me down. Please, Landy, or Landito, the way they nickname they called me, stop it. Stop it, you are making us nervous, you're going to make somebody lose a job. So in many ways, I had to cut links with my family, even when I was in Cuba, and those links have been somehow reestablished now that I am not such a danger for them. That's the sad part of this, very typical of totalitarian society, and it's very dangerous and sad to see it happen here. He shared that in Facebook. I don't want to see his face anymore. And I have seen friendships of years, and I have suffered friendships of years while we were in tyranny in Cuba, and when I was in exile, friendships that lasted years being lost by a completely radicalized climate in America that is affecting the stability, the happiness, the desire to be alive and still smile and be beautiful and work for the future in a democratic society. You know, the most anger in a society, advantage for the radicals. The more violence in a society, even if people die in the streets of America, the better for the radicals. The more immigrants with issues in the border, humanitarian crisis, the better for radicals. That's my perception. When I express that in conferences, I'm called paranoid, traumatized, my speech is not legitimate. You have some mental issues. I have been told that, which is very disrespectful, not to me, but to people with mental issues. That's not a moral condition. That's not a political condition. That only deserves love and total care. And somehow they label the person that came with a provocative speech like me and with a vision of totalitarian society and socialism in America, very skeptical. They try to label you into a clinical speech. I would like, if possible, to mention, say thank you to all of the questions that I am reading here that maybe will not be possible to answer, especially to James Mook, to Liliana Fuentes, which she mentions about the penetrations of American universities in order to influence the younger generations. And of course, the moment you try to prove events like that, you are paranoid, despite the fact that Cuban spies have been convicted in America up to the Pentagon, and including the famous network of the WASP spies. You can watch the film in Netflix. If you want to learn a little about political kitsch, about manipulative agendas, which I completely love, because kitsch, I love kitsch. It's so funny, it's so ridicule, and I enjoy it. So you want to watch a little of political kitsch, please watch the film about the about the WASP network, which eventually was a criminal network of spies that ended up with the murder of American citizens, and how this is idealized. The same with the films about Che Guevara. And eventually there will be films about Fidel Castro. I'm very fascinated by how absolute power, absolute caudillos, absolute dynastic rulers provoke a fascination as long as they include in their speech an anti-market, anti-capitalist speech. Only that is the only thing that you need to survive. And if you allow me a quote, the famous Cuban novelist Alejo Carpentier ended up saying at the end of his life, very cynical, he completely submitted to the Cuban regime, saying, "I am not crazy, I will never fight against the left. A writer cannot survive if you fight the left." That's very sad, and that's a climate that I don't think American citizens are or deserve or want to live in. We deserve a climate where you can fight the right and you can fight the left and you can make fun of traditions, but at the same time you have the right to preserve and love and try those traditions. There is nothing reactionary or conservative in trying to preserve the good things in life that a society has gained. An American society has gained more than many societies, I would say most societies in the world, especially in the last decades. And my message would be, please look back, look how much in civil rights, in human rights has been achieved by the whole of the nation, and try to stop the divide that only pretends to erode the basis of a working, functional democracy, the longest working and functional democracy in the history of mankind.
I think related to Ileana's question is another that's come in specifically asking you, what do you think accounts for the historical appeal of Marxist theories to intellectuals? In particular, curious about Marxism in capitalist societies and the appeal of the philosophy to the intellectual community.
Yeah. Thank you very much, James Mook. Very simple. I'm not an expert in Marxism, but I learned Marxism by heart, by the manuals. I studied Marxism since elementary, secondary, high school, university. There was a discipline called philosophy in Havana University, and they only taught Marxism. That was philosophy. And of course, I don't want to misrepresent or stigmatize. I would say, in fact, the contrary. Marxist theory, Marxist thought, Marxist thinking only exists in open, free, democratic, capitalist society. The Marxist thinking, the level of theoretical people thinking Marxism and writing about Marxism in Cuba is very low and poor. They don't know how to handle things. They are not courageous or free enough to revise, to be revisionist. There are not Marcuse. I'm not saying that I especially love him, but there are not Herbert Marcuse in Cuba. There are not Michel Foucault in Cuba. There are not good Marxist thinkers in Cuba, the same way that we don't have psychoanalysis, schizoanalysis, all the legacies, good legacies of leftist thinking and intellectuality in the 20th century in free, open societies. We don't have that. The Marxist thinking in Cuba is stereotypical, manualist, following the manuals. When somebody crosses a mediocre line, immediately is considered like a dissident. They need to conciliate all the time the interest of the real estate or the interest of the establishment or status quo in Cuba with their theory. They are not free theorists to talk about Marxism. So my answer would be, I really appreciate how free and how developed Marxist thinkers can be in the 21st century, as long as they don't start praising the Cuban Revolution as utopia. And as a reference, how poor, how intellectually mediocre is the Marxist thinker generated on the island. It seems to be completely like a pamphlet. And as an intellectual, I like to read challenging ideas. I cannot read Marxist thinkers in Cuba because they don't challenge me. They try to lecture me, discipline me into a kind of a manual doctrine or dogma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see we have another question from, or the first question here from Mario about recent attack showing that you personally continue to be a target for the Cuban regime. So we have someone whose wife was also directly attacked by the foreign minister, Bruno Perea, at a press conference. Before this, how have you defended yourself, and what do you consider to be the steps we should take to defend ourselves against a regime that is acting out against the U.S.?
Sorry, can you summarize the end of the question?
Sure. So in terms of you, you know, as someone who has been a target for the Cuban regime, what are steps people can take to defend themselves?
I mean, the level of vulnerability matches the level of impunity of the regime. The level of the vulnerability of the society, of the citizens in Cuba matches the level of impunity. It takes a lot of despair sometimes, courage, moral values, sometimes Christian values, the defense of Christian fundamental values. Many of them now constitute human universal values, and maybe there will be attacking me for saying such a thing, but it takes that kind of moral reservoir in order to face the reality of a life that will become completely not livable in Cuba. This applies to the leaders of civil society. This applies to a humble blogger like me, losing your job, losing many of your friends, your telephone completely monitored by the regime, even getting attacks online, getting stigmatized, caricaturized. You know, they can try to go for your body, physical defects, trying to match if you are tall or small, or your hair, trying to match that with a moral defect. all these kind of really, and now the word really matches, no? Retrograde approaches to the human person. Many things that here in America are inconceivable to refer. Do you want an example, a painful example that still hurts me personally? I heard an officer of the Ministry of the Interior in Cuba, G2 officer, saying, I don't know why that black man, he was referring to a colleague of mine in the civil society, in the dissidents in Cuba, I don't know why he opposes the regime, because the revolution made that the black person into persons. They made the black person, hicieron a los negros persona. They turned the African Cuban, they call in Cuba, we use the term black person, people of color, they were turned into persons, they were turned into human beings thanks to the revolution. I had never heard anything more racist, discriminatory, arrogant, and why not, supremacist. In this case, communist supremacy, completely disregarding the intellectual values, the effort to learn, to write, the courage of a family man, a friend of mine in Cuba, African Cuban, completely disregarded by a white officer of the Ministry of the Interior. The same Ministry of the Interior that then receives, through their ministers and attachés, then receive senators from America, representative of the Communist Party, representative from NGOs like the Center for Democracy in the Americas and many others, some of them based in Washington. I'm very happy that they can exist, and then they welcome them, the same racist supremacists. But you know what? We don't have that speech in Cuba. Cuba is so poor and so retrograde in intellectual terms. That's a consequence of 6 decades of totalitarian regime, that we don't even handle those terms. We don't really know what is about, and sometimes we make total ridicule because we haven't advanced the cause of the rights of minorities, the rights of women, the rights of homosexuals, where Cuban homosexuals express their love by marrying each other. They express in Miami. Cuban homosexuals go to conservative Miami to marry because revolutionary and progressive Cuba does not allow in law or in any kind of laboral legislation to favor or defend the rights of LGBT community. That's the reality of the revolution. I haven't created that. I'm only trying to express what my gay and lesbian friends and trans friends tell me. This is the country where I will never marry the person I love, period. That's Cuba.
Great. Thank you so much for that perspective. We have just about 6 more minutes altogether. So I think, Orlando, we have time for one more question that has come up in a couple of threads here, just regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. In particular, one of the co-founders did recently state that she's an organizer and trained Marxist. So what are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement and any alleged support of communism, possibly Castro? And with so many people supporting BLM, how do you see this impacting the support of communism in the US?
Yeah, I will not go into much information about Black Lives Matter. It's very little time. I will be not appropriate to go into such a complex topic. And maybe they are referring to when Fidel Castro died in November 2016, the National Organization of Black Lives Matter issued a note, not only mourning the death of the tyrant, which is a human being, so they are perfectly have their right to mourn their death, but also saying that Fidel Castro, the white farm owner, because Cuba is like a huge factory, a huge farm, that Fidel Castro somehow was an inspiration for all the African American community. I know many people in the African American community, leaders in the community here in San Luis, and they are completely person that would not agree with that idea. They don't like people in power for 60 years. They wouldn't like Eisenhower in power, or Kennedy in power, or Nixon in power, or Carter in power, or Reagan in power. You don't have a man for 60 decades in power, even if he is illuminated from above. It's not like that. And unfortunately, some of the leaders of Black Lives Matter at that point, well, had very little historical perspective as to go public to defend a man that his virtue was that he opposed the American establishment. Please, let's try to break the logic that the enemy of my enemy is my ally. The enemy of my enemy, most likely, my dear friends from Black Lives Matter, the enemy of your enemy probably is your worst enemy. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point historical evidence will prove how the Castro regime accepted many of the African American leaders of the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers in order, like in a pact with an American government, in order to get rid of a certain citizens in the United States of America. So that's a very complex scenario. There is some here that it is, well, anyway, I am hearing a ringing. So it's a very complex story. Please avoid stereotypes. The same way you shouldn't be blindly following any leader in America, you shouldn't be following blindly any leader in Cuba. And this message also goes not only to Black Lives Matter, but to Michael Moore, to Oliver Stone, to all the high linguistic, chunky and the like, which are great intellectuals and suddenly become like little when it comes to critically analyze the enemies of the open society.
Wonderful. Muchas gracias, Orlando, y a todos. Thanks so much to Orlando and for everyone joining us here today. Hope that you all were able to get a lot out of this talk. We certainly appreciate your support and involvement. I did want to just reiterate that the St. Louis Commission is committed to telling stories like those of Orlando, committed to supporting the mission to educate people on the lived reality of communism. And I mentioned earlier in my intro that we've been doing quite a bit just in a very short amount of time. So I'd really like to, again, thank you all for your interest in this topic. Thank you all for joining us and for attending. I did want to go ahead and share a little bit more information on the ways that you can get involved here in St. Louis. So I'd like to invite those of you who are here, of course, those of you who aren't, to join us when we do virtual events and in other ways. But I'd really like to invite everyone to get involved with this local commission. There are plenty of ways to do so. And we have people that are helping us to share information. And as I mentioned earlier, call for transparency in the city of St. Louis, because we do have quite a bit of both organized communist activity, and then we also have some local groups that are kind of calling for an uprising and rebellion. So VOC St. Louis is active on social media, and we also have information and a sign-up interest form on our website at victimsofcommunism.org/STL. We are also on Facebook at VOCSTL and on Twitter at VOC_STL. So thanks, Orlando. Thanks to Ashley. Thanks to Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Voices of Freedom webinar.
Thank you.
Have a great day.